The sun shone with polite insistence over the village of High Barton, the sort of June day that made even the sternest churchwarden feel mildly charitable, and the vicar consider adding a hymn of thanksgiving for the weather. Gardens were in full bloom, and in the meticulously tended grounds of the Wentworth estate, Mrs. Lavinia Keene's annual Rose Garden luncheon was well underway. It was an affair of subtle prestige, not ostentatiously grand, but of a kind that carried social implications for those invited, and still more for those who were not. The cream of High Barton society, from Colonel and Mrs. Bradstone to young Dr. Everley and the vicar's wife, fluttered in and out of the shade provided by pale green parasols and the tall cypress trees lining the gravel path. Among them, seated, slightly apart under the generous sweep of a copper beech, was Miss Jane Marple. Clad in a soft gray dress with a neat straw hat, she sipped her tea with a serene, unobtrusive air. She had been invited out of a vague sense of duty rather than enthusiasm. Lavinia Keene was not one to appreciate unpretentious intellect unless it came with a title or a check. "You must try the cucumber sandwiches, Miss Marple," cooed Lavinia, sweeping past with a silver tray. "Cook has used white pepper, you know. It's the continental way." "How clever," Miss Marple murmured, taking a sandwich she had no intention of eating. "Though I always thought cucumbers were a bit suspicious on their own, let alone encouraged by pepper." Lavinia offered a brittle laugh and turned to greet the next guest, a tall, dark-haired man in a sharply pressed linen suit who had arrived alone and late. His presence stirred the atmosphere with a new electricity, though the introductions were rather vague. "Oh, Mr. Lyon, this is Miss Marple of St. Mary Mead," Lavinia said with the hurried tone of someone required to do a chore. "She's something of a local fixture." "I am," said Miss Marple kindly, rising just enough to incline her head. "Like lichen on an old wall, I suppose. And you're a friend of Lavinia's?" The man hesitated. "Of sorts. I'm an acquaintance of her late husband, actually. Business dealings years ago. Henry Lyon." The name did not seem to strike any chords with the surrounding guests, though. The vicar's wife blinked rather rapidly. Lavinia's face remained unreadably fixed. "You must see the roses, Mr. Lyon," Lavinia said, recovering herself. "We've had a new hybrid, Sir Dorian, blooming just this week. Very rare. Very particular shade of scarlet. Shall I show you?" They walked off together, Lyon's tall form trailing behind Lavinia's stiff-backed authority. Miss Marple watched them go, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. The luncheon ambled on, with iced sherry making its genteel rounds and gossip flowing more freely now that everyone had a glass in hand. The talk turned, as it often did, to the Wentworth legacy. Edward Wentworth, Lavinia's deceased husband, had been a financier of some repute, and his death 2 years prior had left a noticeable vacuum, particularly in the matter of Lavinia's social hosting, which had become more extravagant since. "I hear she's run through half the estate already," murmured Mrs. Bradstone confidentially to Miss Marple. "Between those new greenhouses and the Italian gardener, it's a miracle she's not selling off the silver." Miss Marple merely nodded. "Gardening is an expensive hobby," she replied, "especially when one uses it to cover other matters." Before Mrs. Bradstone could respond, a sharp scream split the afternoon. It came from the direction of the rose garden. There was a startled stillness, as though the sunlight itself had caught its breath. Then chairs scraped back, hats tumbled, and the entire assembly rose as one. Miss Marple remained seated for a beat longer than most, sipping the last of her tea. "I do hope," she murmured to herself, "it isn't the Italian gardener." She rose, tucked her gloves into her handbag, and began making her way toward the source of the commotion. The rose garden was a picture of cultivated beauty, bushes of Old English roses in cream, blush, coral, and crimson, arranged in thoughtful rows leading to a carved stone sundial at the center. A woman in a flowered dress, Lavinia's maid, Elsie, was clutching the edge of a trellis and sobbing. At her feet, half hidden by a blooming Sir Dorian rose, was the body of Mr. Henry Lyon. He lay on his back, eyes wide and unseeing, a dark stain blooming like an unholy flower across his white linen shirt. There was no sign of a struggle, only the unnatural stillness that made death unmistakable even before the doctor arrived. I found him like that," Elsie cried. "Mrs. Keene had gone to fetch another guest and I came to collect the champagne. Glasses and he was, oh God, he was just there." Lavinia stood a few paces away, face pale but expression resolute. "He must have collapsed. The heat, perhaps. Or a seizure?" "Quite possibly," murmured Dr. Everly, who had arrived and crouched beside the body. But there was something strained in his voice. "No, not a seizure," he said after a moment, glancing up. "He's been stabbed, quite precisely, just under the ribs. A very clean wound, almost surgical. There was a ripple of shocked gasps, and someone dropped a teacup onto the gravel. Miss Marple looked not at the body, but at the roses. Specifically, at the Sir Dorian bush blooming beside Mr. Lyon's fallen form. "One doesn't usually bring a knife to a rose garden," she said aloud, to no one in particular, but someone, she suspected, very much had. The sun had slipped a few degrees lower in the sky by the time the police arrived. Its golden light, once warm and cheerful, now painted the gravel paths and rose petals with a somber hue. Constable Frank Prowse, a young man with earnest eyes and an uncomfortable stiffness, in formal situations had been first on the scene. He stood now by the edge of the rose garden, notebook in hand, trying to preserve the dignity his uniform afforded him amid the murmur of restless guests. Inspector Crayford followed shortly after, a sturdy man with a square jaw and a brow perpetually furrowed, as if the weight of justice physically pressed down upon him. He knelt beside Henry Lyon's body, now carefully cordoned off by garden chairs and lace parasols used to mark a crude perimeter. Dr. Everly stepped forward with measured words. "Single stab wound just below the sternum. No sign of defensive injury. Death would have been quick, I imagine. Shock and blood loss. Perhaps both. A deliberate blow." Crayford grunted. "A gentleman doesn't usually get himself stabbed in the middle of a rose garden during luncheon. Someone must have seen something. I saw him walking off with Mrs. Keene," offered the vicar's wife nervously. "She was showing him the Sir Dorian rose. Said it had just come into bloom." Lavinia, standing a short distance away, turned sharply at the mention of her name. She looked more composed now, though her eyes had a brittle gleam. "I left him in the rose garden for just a moment," she said, voice carefully modulated. "I'd gone to fetch Reverend Eccles. He'd expressed interest in the new hybrid. When I returned—" She trailed off, glancing toward the body with something between disbelief and indignation, as though the murder had violated not just Henry Lyon, but the dignity of her afternoon. Crayford's eyes narrowed. "And Mr. Lyon, how well did you know him?" Lavinia hesitated. "Not well. As I said, he had been a business acquaintance of my late husband. He came by unexpectedly this morning and mentioned he was passing through the area. I extended an invitation out of politeness." Miss Marple, who had been quietly standing beside a trellis laced with ivory pink climbing roses, looked up from her thoughtful study of a broken stem. "He was quite well dressed for someone passing through unexpectedly." Crayford turned. "Miss Marple?" "I happened to notice," she said, her tone mild. "His shoes were polished, his cuffs clean, his linen was freshly pressed, not what one wears on a whim, no luggage either, unless it was left elsewhere." Crayford gave her a look that mingled suspicion and reluctant respect. He had encountered Miss Marple once before, during a peculiar case involving a poisoned chocolate box and a false will, and remembered how she had dismantled his theory in 2 polite sentences. He cleared his throat. "We'll search the house," he said to Prowse. "See if he left anything behind. Letters, a suitcase. Anything to tell us why he was here. I think," Miss Marple continued gently, "that we should also be asking who wanted him not to be here. The ripple of unease that followed her words was almost imperceptible, but she noted it. A stilled breath here, a glance exchanged there. In particular, she observed young Gilda Trent, Lavinia's niece, whose face had gone rather pale. Gilda had been helping with the luncheon, flitting from guest to guest with trays of tarts and cordial, her cheerful demeanor a little too bright, a little too rehearsed. Now she stood to one side near the rose arch, gripping the stem of an empty champagne glass with white knuckles. "I saw him arguing," she said suddenly, her voice brittle. "Mr. Lyon. He was speaking with someone, quietly, but angry-like. Near the orchard path, Crayford turned at once." "When?" "Just before luncheon started," she replied. "I was cutting through to the kitchens. I heard raised voices, only fragments. It's too late now, and something about a promise. I didn't see who he was talking to, just his back. The other person turned away too quickly." "Why didn't you say anything earlier?" Crayford asked. Gilda looked down. I wasn't sure it meant anything. People argue." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Indeed they do. Though in gardens, arguments do tend to end in pruning rather than stabbing." The inspector frowned. "Who else was here early? Before luncheon?" "I was," offered Colonel Bradstone. "Arrived just after 11. The wife insisted on getting the first pick of the strawberries." Several guests murmured in agreement, listing their various arrival times, but none admitted to hearing the argument. Gilda's statement hung uncomfortably in the air, unresolved. Crayford turned back to Lavinia. "Did Mr. Lyon give any reason for his visit? Any hint that there might be unpleasant business?" Lavinia pressed her lips into a thin line. "He said he had something to return. A letter or some such. Something my husband left behind, he claimed. But he didn't produce anything." Miss Marple tilted her head. "A letter? How very curious. And yet he brought no bag. I assumed it was in his coat," Lavinia said crisply. "I didn't press him for details." Crayford stood up, brushing his hands on his coat. "Right. We'll need to search his pockets. Frank, see to it." Constable Prowse gingerly knelt beside the body, checking the inner lining of the jacket, the trouser pockets, and finally the breast pocket. He looked up, puzzled. "Nothing but a small notebook, sir." He handed it to Crayford, who flipped it open. A few scribbled lines, a list of initials and figures, then a name underlined twice. E. Wentworth. Edward Wentworth. Lavinia's late husband. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Mr. Lyon was following something. Or someone. The question is, did he find what he was looking for before he died? Or was it the finding that killed him? No one answered. Crayford stared at the notebook, then at the rose garden where Henry Lyon's body still lay. "We'll need to speak to everyone," he said. "One by one. Guests, staff, anyone who might have seen or heard anything." The sun began to sink. Behind the cypress trees, casting long shadows across the lawn, the guests were quietly ushered indoors. Dr. Everly saw to the removal of the body, while Prowse cordoned off the rose garden entirely. Miss Marple lingered at the edge of the scene. "Eyes on the Sir Dorian rosebush. What a strange name for a flower," she mused aloud. Sir Dorian. Something romantic, and just a little tragic. She bent closer, noticing the broken stem she had studied earlier. Not trampled, not torn by accident, but snipped, and not with garden shears either. With something narrower, sharper, rising. Slowly, she walked back to the house, her mind carefully unfolding the petals of a memory. A story of misplaced affection, betrayal, and an heirloom hidden in plain sight. She didn't have the answer yet. But she could feel its scent on the breeze. And in Miss Marple's experience, roses always told the truth, eventually. As evening settled over the Wentworth estate, the grand old house was transformed from a scene of genteel leisure to one of quiet tension. The guests had retreated indoors, each given a polite but firm request to remain available for questioning. The servants, too, moved with hushed urgency, conscious of the gravity of the situation. Miss Marple, having excused herself briefly, now found herself seated in the drawing room with Lavinia Keene. The widow's composure was remarkable, yet her eyes betrayed the faintest tremor of unease beneath the practiced calm. She sat poised with the faintest curl of her lip, fingers delicately folded in her lap. "I must admit, Miss Marple, I find it difficult to believe anyone could wish Henry harm," Lavinia said, her voice low and smooth. "He was a man of no enemies, surely. Only business to attend to, and that was settled long ago." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Ah, Mrs. Keene, it is often the business left unsettled or the debts unpaid that can prompt the sharpest quarrels, and not always of the financial kind." Lavinia's eyes flickered, though she said nothing. "Tell me," Miss Marple continued, "what exactly did Mr. Lyon claim he had to return? You mentioned a letter, yes?" "Yes," Lavinia said carefully, "from my late husband. A letter he said had been misplaced, a matter of importance, though he was vague as to its contents. I confess I did not press him. It seemed a trivial matter. But such letters can hold secrets, Mrs. Keene, secrets that might be worth killing." 4. Miss Marple's eyes held a quiet insistence. Lavinia looked away for a moment, then back. "I do not believe it. Edward was a man of honor. I cannot imagine what sort of scandal a letter would hold." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already working through possibilities. Sometimes the letter is less important than who wishes to keep its contents hidden. At that moment, a knock came at the door. It was Constable Prowse, looking a little uncertain. "Inspector Crayford would like to see you, Miss Marple. He's gathering statements in the library." The drawing room felt suddenly colder. Miss Marple rose gracefully. "Thank you, Constable. I'll join him shortly." As she walked down the corridor, Miss Marple reflected on the earlier fragments of gossip and unease. The fact that Gilda Trent had overheard a quarrel was troubling. So was the mention of a promise. What kind of promise, she wondered, could have been so weighty that it led to murder? The library was a large room, lined with towering shelves heavy with leather-bound volumes and faint traces of dust. "Inspector." Crayford sat behind a polished desk, papers scattered before him, his expression grim. "Miss Marple, thank you for coming," he said briskly. "I'm speaking to everyone in turn. Care to assist? Your insights might prove useful." "I'm always happy to listen," she replied mildly. "But the truth often hides in the silences between words." Crayford nodded, gesturing to a chair. "Well, first up is Mrs. Gilda Trent." The young woman, looking pale and flustered, was seated opposite the inspector. "Mrs. Trent, would you please recount what you overheard this afternoon?" Gilda swallowed nervously. "I said I heard Mr. Lyon arguing with someone near the orchard path. I only caught bits. Too late. Now. And something about a promise. I didn't see who he was speaking to." Crayford frowned. "Did you recognize the voice?" "No, sir. It was too quick, and the speaker turned away before I could look." Miss Marple leaned forward. "And what sort of promise, do you think? Something personal or business?" Gilda hesitated, then said, "I don't know. But I think it upset him." Mr. Lyon looked angry. Crayford scribbled notes. "Did you speak to anyone about this?" "No. I thought it was none of my business." Crayford looked up sharply. "In cases like this, everything is someone's business." Gilda flushed, but said nothing more. The next witness was Mrs. Elsie, Lavinia's maid, who had discovered the body. She was trembling as she recounted the moment she found Mr. Lyon lying still beneath the roses. "I was just collecting the glasses," Elsie explained. "I didn't hear anything unusual before. When I came around the corner, he was just there. I screamed, and then everyone came running." "Did you see anyone else nearby?" Miss Marple asked softly. "No, ma'am. The garden was empty except for Mr. Lyon." Crayford nodded. "Thank you, Elsie. Please remain available." One by one, The guests gave their accounts. The vicar, Reverend Eccles, claimed to have been with Lavinia shortly before the murder, admiring the rose hybrids. Colonel Bradstone had been with his wife near the vegetable garden, and Mrs. Bradstone confirmed his alibi. But it was the interview with Lavinia herself that held a peculiar tension. "I find it hard to believe," Crayford said, "that you had no idea Mr. Lyon was carrying anything of importance when he arrived?" Lavinia's eyes flashed briefly. "I told you it was a surprise visit. I was not prepared to host him properly." Miss Marple watched Lavinia closely. "Did you know Mr. Lyon well before today?" "Only in passing. Through my late husband's business." "Had there been any quarrels between them? Any unsettled affairs?" Lavinia hesitated, then said, "Not to my knowledge. Edward was a careful man." "And yet this letter," Miss Marple murmured, "could suggest otherwise." Lavinia said, "Nothing." After the last guest was questioned, Inspector Crayford turned to Miss Marple. "I confess I'm baffled. Mr. Lyon's notebook lists some initials and figures, and this name, E. Wentworth. There's something financial here, I believe." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Money, promises, and old secrets. High Bartons. Soil is rich with them, Inspector." "Did you notice anything unusual in the rose garden?" Crayford asked. "The cut on the Sir Dorian rose," she said. "Not made by garden tools. A sharp, slender blade. Perhaps the murder weapon was used to cut the rose, and then to kill." Crayford rubbed his chin. "A symbolic act, perhaps." "Or a message," Miss Marple suggested. "Roses speak many languages." That night, as the household settled into uneasy silence, Miss Marple sat by her window, looking out over the darkened garden. The moonlight washed the path where Henry Lyon had died. Somewhere in that darkness lay the answer, woven through old debts, whispered promises, and the silent language of the roses. Tomorrow, she would begin again with the servants, the gardeners, anyone who might have glimpsed what others missed. For in High Barton, appearances could be deceiving, and the truth was often thornier than any rose, and Miss Marple was nothing if not patient. Morning. In High Barton brought with it a brittle chill that seemed to seep through the walls of the grand Wentworth house. The dawn mist clung low across the rose garden, softening the edges of the scene of yesterday's tragedy. Yet beneath the fragile quiet, the household was awake with an uneasy energy. Servants bustling about with whispered conversations, guests moving silently like shadows through the corridors, all keenly aware that normalcy had been fractured. Miss Marple, having risen early as was her habit, took the opportunity to step outside before the others stirred. She moved slowly along the gravel path, the dew catching on the folds of her tweed skirt, her eyes scanning the subtle details of the garden. The disturbed soil near the Sir Dorian rosebush, the faint footprints pressed lightly into the earth, and the broken stem she had noted before. There was an order to nature, and when it was upset by human hands, it often left a delicate pattern behind for those who cared to look. Returning indoors, she found Inspector Crayford already in conversation with the housekeeper, Mrs. Witherspoon, in the kitchen. The older woman's face was drawn, the strain of the past day etched into the fine lines around her eyes. "We're trying to reconstruct the events before the murder," Crayford explained. "Any unusual comings and goings? People out of place?" Mrs. Witherspoon nodded. "Well, sir, there was the gardener, Mr. Powell. He came in later than usual today, muddy boots and all. Said he was fixing a broken fence near the orchard, but he seemed flustered when I asked him about it." Miss Marple's interest piqued. "And did he speak to Mr. Lyon or anyone else this morning?" "Not that I saw, Miss Marple, but he did seem to glance toward the rose garden a good deal. Like he was worried about something." Crayford gestured toward the door. "Let's have a word with Mr. Powell." The gardener, a wiry man with earth-stained hands and a face weathered by years of outdoor work, was found near the tool shed, wiping his hands on a rag. When questioned, his expression grew defensive. I was fixing the fence, Inspector. Nothing. More. Did you see Mr. Lyon at all today? Only when he first arrived, Powell said shortly. He asked if the Sir Dorian rose had bloomed yet. I told him yes, and he went off to look for Mrs. Keene. Did you hear any argument near the orchard path this morning? Miss Marple asked softly. Powell hesitated. No, ma'am. Nothing like that. Are you sure? Mrs. Trent said she heard voices raised. Powell's jaw tightened. I'm sure. Miss Marple made a small note in her mind. A contradiction, but not an uncommon one. People heard what they expected to hear, or sometimes what they wished to hear. Later, as the household gathered in the drawing room under Crayford's supervision, Miss Marple began her own quiet inquiries. She had requested to speak privately with Gilda Trent once more. The young woman was sitting by the window, the morning light illuminating her pale face and restless fingers. Gilda, Miss Marple began, you mentioned a promise being spoken of during the argument. Do you recall who might have made such a promise? Gilda bit her lip. No, I'm sorry. I didn't see the other person's face. But I think it was someone Mr. Lyon trusted or feared. Fear often makes for a stronger promise, Miss Marple observed gently. Did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Lyon's behavior before the luncheon? Perhaps nervousness or urgency? Gilda paused. He was tense, kept looking over his shoulder. I thought it was just because he didn't know anyone, but now… Miss Marple nodded. Sometimes strangers carry the weight of old secrets with them. Do you think he was running from something? Or someone? Gilda looked down. I don't. No, but I wish I had said something sooner. Truth often arrives late, Miss Marple said kindly. But it is never too late to listen carefully. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple spoke with several of the household staff. The cook remembered that Henry Lyon had ordered a particular tea blend that morning, insisting it be brewed fresh and taken outside. The butler reported seeing Lavinia Keene in the rose garden shortly before the murder, though she appeared calm. By midday, Miss Marple felt the threads of the puzzle beginning to weave themselves, though the picture remained incomplete. She requested a quiet moment with Lavinia. In the solitude of the drawing room, Lavinia appeared slightly more relaxed, but her eyes held a guarded edge. Mrs. Keene, Miss Marple began, would you mind telling me more about your late husband, Edward Wentworth? Particularly his business dealings. Lavinia's gaze hardened briefly. Edward was cautious. He dealt mostly in investments and property, nothing illegal, I assure you. Did he have enemies? Disputes? Lavinia hesitated, then said softly, there were disagreements, yes. Family disputes, business rivalries, but nothing worth killing over. Sometimes it is not the disputes themselves, but the secrets they hide that prove deadly, Miss Marple said. Lavinia's composure wavered just for a moment before she quickly regained her calm. Mr. Lyon said he had a letter from Edward. Something important. Do you know what it might have contained? No, he never showed it to me. Would you mind if I saw your late husband's correspondence? Anything you might have saved? Lavinia's lips pressed together. I'll ask the housekeeper to find what I have. But I doubt there's anything revealing. Miss Marple inclined her head. Thank you, Mrs. Keene. Sometimes the smallest things, an overlooked letter, a forgotten envelope, can unlock the greatest mysteries. After Lavinia left, Miss Marple was joined by Inspector Crayford, who looked tired but determined. We're no closer to a motive or suspect, he admitted. Everyone claims innocence and alibi. Miss Marple smiled faintly. That is often the way. But people are not always truthful, Inspector. Crayford sighed. I fear the solution lies buried. In the past, some secret the Wentworths carried. Secrets have a way of blooming again, Miss Marple said, especially in gardens like these. Before the afternoon waned, the housekeeper returned with a small box of letters. Among them was a single envelope addressed to Henry Lyon, postmarked, "Just 2 days ago." Miss Marple carefully broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was hurried, tense. "Henry, the truth must not come to light. Promise me you will leave High Barton and forget the past, for all our sakes. There are those who would not forgive, and whose patience is at an end. Trust no one." Miss Marple looked up at Crayford. "The promise mentioned by Miss Trent." Crayford frowned. "Who could have sent this?" "That, Inspector, is the question." As dusk approached once more, the house seemed to hold its breath. The shadows deepened, and with them, the web of secrets grew ever more tangled. But Miss Marple was certain of one thing. The truth was close, and soon the roses of High Barton would reveal their thorniest secret yet. The letter's words lingered, heavily in the air, their warning tone echoing through the quiet drawing room where Miss Marple and Inspector Crayford sat, the fading light casting long shadows across the polished wood and faded floral upholstery. The vague menace it conveyed, so stark against the gentle surroundings of High Barton, suggested that beneath the village's serene surface lay currents far more turbulent and dangerous than anyone had yet admitted. Miss Marple folded the letter delicately, her fingers tracing the worn paper as if it might impart some hidden meaning. "The writer warns Henry Lyon to leave, to forget the past. But what exactly is this past? And who among us is so fearful of its revelation?" Crayford rubbed his temples. "If only we had a name, or some clue as to who might have sent this." "That, Inspector, is where the art of observation must step in," she replied. "Sometimes it is the small overlooked details that open the door to the truth." The door opened quietly, and Lavinia Keene entered, her posture poised but her eyes betraying a flicker of anxiety. She held in her hands a small bundle of papers, which she placed on the table. "I found these among Edward's things," she said softly. "Business letters mostly, but a few personal notes as well. Perhaps they will shed some light." Miss Marple accepted the papers with a nod of thanks and began to sift through them. Most were mundane: letters from estate agents, financial statements, requests for payments. But one particular note caught her eye. It was a brief, sharply worded message written on a slip of stationery from a nearby village. "Meet me at the crossroads at dusk. We must settle this once and for all, or all will be lost." No signature. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. A meeting at dusk, unsigned. This suggests a secret pact, or a threat veiled in formality. "Do you think Henry Lyon was involved in something dangerous?" Crayford asked. "Dangerous or desperate? The crossroads often mark a place where decisions are made, sometimes irrevocably," Miss Marple mused. "But it is the once and for all that suggests a final reckoning." She looked up at Lavinia. "Did your husband have any enemies who might have demanded such a meeting?" Lavinia hesitated, then said quietly, "There was my late husband's estranged brother, Charles Wentworth. They were not on speaking terms for years. Edward refused to acknowledge him in the family will." "Charles Wentworth," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "That is a lead worth following." That afternoon, with Crayford's agreement, Miss Marple arranged for a discreet inquiry about Charles Wentworth. She learned that he had indeed been seen near High Barton in recent weeks, staying in a local inn under an assumed name. Later, as the sun cast a warm glow over the village green, Miss Marple and Crayford set out for the inn. The place was modest, with faded curtains and the scent of peat smoke lingering in the air. The innkeeper, a burly man with a wary expression, recognized the name immediately. "Mr. Wentworth?" "Yes, he's been here off and on for the past month. Keeps to himself mostly. Comes and goes at odd hours." "Did you notice if he had any visitors? Or if he left suddenly yesterday?" Crayford inquired. The innkeeper shook his head. "No visitors that I saw. And yesterday, he left just before noon. Didn't say where he was headed." "Thank you," Miss Marple said kindly. Outside, the two exchanged glances. His sudden departure fits with the timeline of the murder, Crayford said grimly. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, but to confront a man who has been cut off from family fortune is to stir up old resentments that run deep. As evening approached, they returned to High Barton, where the atmosphere had grown even more charged. Rumors now swirled that Charles Wentworth might be the key to unraveling the mystery. Yet, to Miss Marple's mind, the answer was not so straightforward. That night, seated by the fireplace, Miss Marple examined the letter from Henry Lyon once again. The penmanship was hurried but controlled, the paper of fine quality, clearly from someone accustomed to discretion. Miss Marple pondered the possible senders. Charles Wentworth seemed an obvious suspect, but what if the letter had come from someone closer, someone with more intimate knowledge? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock. It was Gilda Trent, the young woman who had heard the quarrel. "Miss Marple," she said nervously, "I've been thinking. I may have seen something else yesterday." Miss Marple invited her to sit. Gilda took a deep breath. "After the argument, I saw a figure in the orchard path. Not Mr. Lyon, but someone watching him. Someone I recognized." "And who was that?" Miss Marple asked, leaning forward. "It was Colonel Bradstone. He looked angry, more than just a casual observer." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "The Colonel, you say? And did he approach Mr. Lyon?" "No, he stayed hidden. But I'm certain he was there." "Thank you, Gilda. You may have given us a new piece of the puzzle." The next morning, Miss Marple arranged to speak with the Bradstones, beginning with Colonel Bradstone himself. The man was a distinguished figure, his military bearing still evident despite the age creeping upon him. He met Miss Marple's gaze, evenly but with a guarded reserve. "Colonel, I understand you were near the orchard yesterday," she began. "I was," he replied curtly. "Taking a walk, nothing more." "Did you happen to see Henry Lyon at any point?" "Only briefly. He seemed preoccupied." "Did you hear any quarrel?" "No, I did not. Nor did I confront him." Miss Marple studied him quietly. "And yet you were seen watching Mr. Lyon." The Colonel's jaw tightened. "I was simply curious." Mr. Lyon's arrival stirred some old feelings. "I admit I am not pleased by his presence here." "May I ask why?" The Colonel sighed. "Edward Wentworth was an old friend, but also a man with secrets. I warned him to be cautious." Miss Marple nodded. "Caution is often wise, Colonel. But sometimes fears lead men to rash deeds." When Mrs. Bradstone joined the conversation, the mood shifted. She was warm and genteel, but there was an edge beneath her politeness. "I find it regrettable," she said softly, "that Mr. Lyon's presence has disturbed the peace. There are things best left undisturbed." "Such as?" Miss Marple inquired. "Mrs." Bradstone's eyes flicked toward the garden. "Old debts, old promises, long-buried mistakes." Miss Marple's mind pieced together the fragments. The letter, the meeting at the crossroads, the promise. There were layers of history here, intertwining lives with grudges and fears. And beneath it all, a murder. As afternoon waned, Miss Marple requested a walk with Inspector Crayford through the rose garden. She knelt by the Sir Dorian rosebush again, tracing the delicate blade cuts she had noticed before. "This was no accident," she murmured. "The murderer chose this flower deliberately, perhaps as a signature or warning." Crayford looked thoughtful. "A message in the garden." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes. Sometimes the flowers speak louder than words." Their conversation was interrupted by the sudden arrival of the vicar, Reverend Eccles, who bore news. That added another twist. "I found this in the study," he said, handing over a folded piece of paper. It was a hastily scrawled note addressed to Henry Lyon. "Meet me at midnight, alone. The truth cannot wait." Miss Marple took the note carefully, feeling the weight of the mystery grow heavier still. Someone was playing a dangerous game, and Henry Lyon's death was only the beginning. As dusk fell once again over High Barton, Miss Marple stood silently in the garden, the scent of roses thick in the air. The village held its breath, caught between the secrets of the past and the chilling promise of revelations yet to come. In the quiet, Miss Marple knew one truth above all. The murderer was watching, waiting, and ready to strike again. The note in Miss Marple's hand felt colder than the evening air, as if the words themselves carried the chill of an unseen threat. Midnight, a time when shadows lengthen and the veil between truth and deceit grows thin. The promise of a secret meeting so late, coupled with the earlier warning to Henry Lyon, deepened the web of mystery ensnaring High Barton. Miss Marple tucked the note carefully into her reticule as she and Inspector Crayford made their way back to the vicarage, their footsteps muted on the winding village lanes. The quiet hum of the village at dusk, dogs barking, shutters closing, the faint murmur of voices, belied the tension that gripped them. Everyone was waiting, some with hope, others with dread. In the vicarage drawing room, Lavinia Keene was seated by the fire, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. The letter and notes now spread before her, symbols of a past she perhaps wished remained buried. Miss Marple glanced at her kindly. "You must understand, Mrs. Keene, that sometimes the past calls out to be heard, even when it brings pain." Lavinia nodded slowly. Edward was a complicated man. He never spoke of Charles, nor of whatever it was that unsettled him so deeply. "I feared there was more to his life than the calm surface I saw." Secrets, Mrs. Keene, have a way of rising to the surface, no matter how carefully they are hidden, Miss Marple replied gently. Inspector Crayford, ever practical, spoke next. The note demanding a midnight meeting could be a clue or a trap. If someone wanted to lure Henry Lyon, they might have done so with that very note. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly with a mixture of sadness and resolve. And if so, the meeting was never kept, unless it was kept in silence. That night, the village slept uneasily. Only the occasional bark of a dog or the rustling of leaves disturbed the fragile peace. But Miss Marple did not retire early. Instead, she sat by her window, gazing out toward the rose garden bathed in moonlight. The shadows seemed to dance among the blooms, and her mind worked silently, sifting through every word, every glance, every subtle gesture she had observed. The next morning brought a fresh ripple of unease. At dawn, a frantic message arrived. At the constable's office, the gardener, Mr. Wilkins, had been found unconscious near the crossroads, not far from where the midnight meeting had been proposed. When Miss Marple and Crayford arrived at the scene, they found Wilkins pale and shaken, clutching a crumpled scrap of paper in his trembling hand. "What happened here?" Crayford asked. Wilkins looked up, eyes wide with fear. I was taking an early walk, as I often do, to check on the greenhouses. Then someone came up behind me and struck me. I don't know who. It was dark." "Did you get a look at your attacker?" Miss Marple asked softly. Wilkins shook his head. "No, but before he hit me, I dropped this." He extended the scrap of paper. Miss Marple took it carefully. It was a torn corner from a letter bearing only a few words. "For your silence, or all will be lost." Her eyes narrowed. "Threats continue to escalate." Crayford frowned. "Who would want to silence the gardener?" "That is the question," Miss Marple said. "Mr. Wilkins may know more than he realizes." At the vicarage, Miss Marple gathered the key figures for a discreet conversation, sensing the time was ripe to observe their reactions. As they sat in the quiet parlor, Lavinia Keene, Colonel and Mrs. Bradstone, and Gilda Trent all appeared on edge. "I have been thinking about these threats," Miss Marple began. "Someone here fears a secret being revealed. It is no coincidence that the gardener was attacked near the crossroads where the meeting was supposed to take place." The Colonel's eyes darkened. "It seems the past is determined to claw its way into the present, Mrs. Bradstone nodded, her voice low. There are debts unpaid and mistakes remembered, but to attack a man of peace is reckless. Gilda Trent bit her lip. Do you think the attacker was trying to prevent something from being discovered? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Indeed, Miss Trent. It is often fear that drives people to desperate acts. Lavinia's voice trembled. But who among us would harm a humble gardener? Miss Marple's gaze swept the group. Sometimes those we least suspect carry the heaviest burdens. The discussion was interrupted by a knock at the door. A breathless constable entered with news. A local man had found a discarded locket near the rose garden, tarnished but unmistakably one that belonged to Lavinia Keene. The locket contained a miniature portrait of Edward Wentworth, painted in softer, happier times. Miss Marple took the locket, turning it over slowly. This was lost the night of the murder, yet it was never mentioned before. Lavinia's face paled. I didn't realize I'd dropped it. Or perhaps it was dropped deliberately, Miss Marple suggested. A subtle clue or a cry for help. The discovery stirred whispers among the villagers gathered outside the vicarage. Rumors thickened like the evening fog, spreading tales of secret meetings, old grudges, and a family torn by betrayal. That evening, Miss Marple sought out Mr. Wilkins. In the quiet warmth of the gardener's cottage, he sat by the fire, the bruise on his temple still swollen. Mr. Wilkins, she said gently, you must tell me everything you saw and heard before the attack. Wilkins swallowed nervously. I was near the crossroads just before dawn. I thought I heard voices, 2 men, arguing. One sounded like Mr. Lyon, but the other, I couldn't be sure. Can you remember what they said? Wilkins nodded, slowly. Something about the will and keeping the secret. Then footsteps running away. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. The will? An inheritance dispute, perhaps. Edward's will was a source of great tension, Wilkins admitted. I heard rumors that Charles Wentworth was contesting it. Miss Marple stood, steady and resolute. Thank you, Mr. Wilkins. You have given us a valuable piece of the puzzle. As the night deepened once again, the pieces began to fall into place. Old resentments over family fortune, secret meetings under the cover of darkness, threats scribbled on hastily torn paper. All signs pointed toward a tangled history of greed and fear. But Miss Marple sensed that even this was only the surface. The true motive, the heart of the secret, still lay hidden beneath layers of deception. And so, as the village settled into uneasy slumber, Miss Marple prepared to watch and wait for the next move in this quiet game of shadows. High Barton, she knew, was a village that held its secrets tightly. But secrets like roses could wither or bloom under the right conditions. The night was far from over. The morning mist clung low over High Barton as dawn spilled its pale light across the village, green, casting long shadows and lending the landscape a ghostly stillness. Miss Marple stepped out of the vicarage with measured calm, though inside her thoughts were restless as ever. The previous night's revelations lingered like a fog, each detail beckoning her to peer deeper into the tangled relationships of this seemingly tranquil village. At the crossroads where Wilkins had been attacked, a faint trail of disturbed earth caught her eye, a subtle sign of hurried footsteps, or perhaps a struggle. She bent down, her fingers tracing the ground lightly, then straightened. It's small, but it speaks, she murmured. Someone left in haste. Inspector Crayford, standing beside her with an umbrella against the drizzle now beginning to fall, nodded thoughtfully. We have little to go on, but every clue counts. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the rose garden beyond the hedgerows. There, amid the blooming bushes, the air seemed heavier, as if the petals themselves held whispers of past deeds. She had the distinct impression that the garden was more than just a backdrop. It was a silent witness. Later that morning, the vicarage filled with a cautious gathering. The village constable had brought news. A second letter, similar in handwriting to the midnight note, had been found pinned to the church door. This one was more explicit in its threat, speaking of the price of silence and the sins buried. In the garden? The word sent a shiver through the assembled group. Mrs. Bradstone, clutching her lace handkerchief, whispered, "What sins could possibly be buried in such a beautiful place?" Gilda Trent, eyes bright with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, added, "Perhaps not sins, but secrets. And secrets, as Miss Marple has reminded us, have their own ways of coming to light." Lavinia Keene's face remained guarded, though a flicker of anxiety passed over her features. Miss Marple caught it, storing the subtle cue away like a treasured key. Inspector Crayford cleared his throat. "Given these escalating threats, I believe our focus should widen. If someone is trying to intimidate Henry Lyon and now the villagers, the motive must be substantial." Miss Marple nodded in agreement. "Indeed, Inspector, and it would be wise to observe who benefits most from these disturbances." Throughout the day, Miss Marple continued her quiet inquiries. She spoke with Mrs. Withers, the postmistress, who mentioned having seen Charles Wentworth lingering near the vicarage the morning after the murder, an unusual presence that did not go unnoticed. "He seemed tense," Mrs. Withers remarked, "and kept glancing around as if watching for someone." Miss Marple made a note of this, her mind weaving the threads. Charles had every reason to be unsettled, given the inheritance dispute hinted at by Wilkins, but was his anxiety guilt, fear, or something else entirely? Her next visit was to the village school, where she met Miss Lacey, the schoolteacher, who confided a secret. Edward Wentworth had visited the schoolroom weeks ago, speaking, in hushed tones with the headmaster. "He seemed worried," Miss Lacey said, though he never explained why. The idea of Edward broaching matters with the headmaster added another layer to the mystery. What concern could the vicar's late husband have had that involved the village's educational heart? Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the delicate balance of relationships. The village was no stranger to petty grievances, but beneath the surface lay wounds that perhaps no one dared to acknowledge openly. That evening, during a subdued tea gathering in the drawing room, the conversation turned to the village's past. Mrs. Bradstone recalled an old scandal involving a lost child decades ago, an event never spoken of but still remembered by some. "It tore families apart," she said quietly. "Perhaps it's connected." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Lavinia, who sat rigidly, lips pressed thin. The past often cast long shadows, she thought. Shadows that could darken even the brightest. Rose garden. A sudden knock interrupted the moment. The constable entered, carrying a small, wrapped parcel found near the riverbank. Inside was a rusted antique key, tied with a faded ribbon. "A strange find," Crayford said, handing it to Miss Marple. "No one claims it yet." Miss Marple turned the key over thoughtfully. "A symbol, perhaps, or a literal key to unlocking a secret." The room fell silent as the weight of unspoken implications settled over them. Who had dropped the key, and what door might it open? Later, Miss Marple sought out Henry Lyon, who had been withdrawn since the murder. His grief was tempered by unease, and he welcomed her company. "Henry," she began gently, "this key, does it mean anything to you?" He frowned, taking the key from her hand. "It looks like one from the old Wentworth estate. There are storerooms and cellars beneath the manor that have been locked for years. My father forbade anyone to enter them." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. "Perhaps we should see what lies behind those doors." The following morning, a small party made their way to the manor. The heavy oak door in question groaned open, revealing a narrow stair descending into darkness. Torches were lit, and they stepped carefully into the musty cellar. Dust motes danced in the air as their eyes adjusted. Rows of old crates, faded letters, and relics of a bygone era filled the space. Among the detritus, Miss Marple's gaze settled on a small wooden box, sealed tightly. With trembling hands, Henry opened it to reveal bundles of correspondence and a worn diary, its pages brittle but legible. As Miss Marple began to read aloud, the others gathered close, hanging on every word. April 12th, 1910. The truth must be guarded, but it threatens to unravel all we hold dear. The diary was Edward Wentworth's, chronicling a series of meetings and disputes, details of an illicit relationship, a disputed child, and threats made in hushed tones. The tone was one of fear, desperation, and regret. A chill swept through the group. Here lay a motive far deeper than money or petty grudges, a tangled web of love, betrayal, and silence that had festered beneath the surface of High Barton for years. Miss Marple closed the diary gently. The roses hide more than beauty. They conceal pain that has shaped this tragedy. Outside, the village carried on, unaware of the storm gathering at its heart. But within the vicarage walls, the past and present converged, and the final pieces of the puzzle began to shift into place. Miss Marple knew the day was far from over. The true game had just begun. The air in the cellar was heavy with the scent of aged paper and damp wood, the dim flicker of torches casting wavering shadows on the walls lined with forgotten relics. Miss Marple carefully closed Edward Wentworth's diary and looked around at the small group gathered there: Henry Lyon, Inspector Crayford, and the village constable. Each bore a look of quiet contemplation, the weight of the discovery settling over them like the dust motes in the stale air. "Whatever secrets these pages hold," Miss Marple said softly, "they explain more than one mystery. But they also complicate things. This is no simple crime of passion or greed. It's a story rooted in years of silence and fear." Henry Lyon's fingers brushed the diary again, as if seeking comfort in the fragile pages. "I had no idea, Miss Marple. My father never spoke of this, or perhaps he was afraid to. Fear is often the greatest prisoner," she replied, "and the dead do not always rest easy." The inspector cleared his throat. "We must examine the diary carefully, but also widen our inquiries. If these secrets have lain hidden for so long, someone may be desperate enough to protect them now." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. I suggest we begin by speaking to those closest to the Wentworth family, friends, servants, and any who might have had access to the manor or knowledge of its history." The group ascended from the cellar, the morning sun now fully bathing the village in light that seemed almost too bright for the shadows it had exposed. Miss Marple's mind churned, her subtle observations weaving into a pattern that only she could discern. Her first call was to Mrs. Maple, the housekeeper at the manor, a woman known for her discretion and years of loyal service. The elderly woman welcomed Miss Marple with a guarded smile, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of apprehension. "It's true, Miss Marple, that the Wentworth family kept many things locked away, both in cupboards and in their hearts," Mrs. Maple said as she poured tea. Master Edward was a troubled man in his final years, quiet, withdrawn. He spoke little, but when he did, it was always in whispers and shadows. "Did you ever notice anything unusual around the rose garden or the manor grounds?" "Miss," Marple inquired gently. Mrs. Maple hesitated before replying. "Sometimes, late at night, I heard voices, low and urgent. One evening, I thought I saw Miss Lavinia near the garden well after dark. It was odd, as she often kept to herself and the village." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Lavinia's connection to the garden deepened. She tucked the detail away carefully. Next, she visited the school to speak again with Miss Lacey, who mentioned an additional observation. Edward Wentworth had been carrying a small, locked box when he visited. "He seemed nervous about it," the teacher said. "I assumed it was something private, but now I wonder if it contained more than just papers." The puzzle grew more intricate, the pieces weaving together like the thorny stems of the roses themselves. Back in the vicarage drawing room, Miss Marple convened with Inspector Crayford and Henry Lyon, sharing her findings. The inspector, ever pragmatic, suggested bringing in the villagers for formal questioning, but Miss Marple advised patience. "Too much pressure will only close lips further," she said. "We must let curiosity and observation do their work." That afternoon, as a light drizzle began to fall, Miss Marple wandered alone toward the rose garden. The blooms glistened with raindrops, their perfume faint yet insistent. She paused beside the old well, now covered with a rusted grate, and knelt to peer inside. The darkness seemed impenetrable, but a faint glint near the bottom caught her eye. Pulling out a slender pole, she fished out a small, tarnished locket, its clasp broken and the surface worn smooth by time. Inside, a faded photograph of a young woman smiled back, a likeness unmistakably similar to Lavinia Keene. The locket was a message, a relic of a secret long buried, now resurfacing. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Lavinia's reluctance and nervous glances. What burden did she carry? Later that evening, at the village inn, Miss Marple joined the gathering of villagers, where gossip had begun to churn with renewed vigor. The conversation was a mixture of speculation and veiled accusations. "Lavinia's always been mysterious," one woman whispered. "No one really knows where she came from." Another chimed in, "And what about Charles Wentworth? His strange behavior since the murder has been unsettling. I saw him speaking heatedly with Lavinia just last week." Miss Marple listened carefully, her mind cataloging each rumor, each half-truth. The villagers, in their fear and curiosity, revealed more than they intended. As the evening wore on, Miss Marple gently steered the conversation toward the past. Scandal that Mrs. Bradstone had mentioned, an old tale of a missing child from a neighboring village. She noted how several faces tightened at the mention, including Lavinia's, who excused herself abruptly. Later, Miss Marple found Lavinia sitting quietly by the fire in the vicarage parlor. "Would you care for some tea, dear?" she asked. "Kindly." Lavinia's hands trembled as she accepted the cup. "I fear the past has a way of catching us all, doesn't it?" Miss Marple nodded. "It does, and sometimes it takes a brave soul to face it." With a deep breath, Lavinia began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. She confessed to a secret connection to the missing child scandal, a truth that, if revealed, could shatter reputations and alter the course of many lives. Miss Marple listened with the patience of years, her mind piecing together the implications. This was the heart of the mystery, a knot of pain, shame, and fear that had festered for decades, culminating in Edward Wentworth's death and the unrest gripping the village. Outside, the rain softened to a drizzle, washing the garden anew. The roses remained, beautiful, thorny, and now deeply entwined in a story of love, loss, and silent suffering. Miss Marple's eyes shone with quiet resolve. The next steps in her delicate dance of discovery would require even greater subtlety. The true murderer had not yet revealed their hand, but the walls of silence were beginning to crumble. In the stillness of the vicarage, the gentle detective prepared for the final tests, where psychology, patience, and the faintest flicker of human nature would illuminate the darkest corners of High Barton's secrets. The dawn crept softly over High Barton, spilling pale light across the dew-kissed gardens where the roses stood as silent sentinels to secrets long buried. Miss Marple, seated by the drawing-room window, sipped her morning tea with the careful composure that belied the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. The confession from Lavinia Keene lingered, delicate yet potent, threading new tension through the tapestry of the village's tangled past. News had already begun to stir that morning. A second crime. The village was gripped by a fresh wave of shock when the body of Mr. Charles Wentworth was discovered in the old stables, his face pale and his expression frozen in surprise. Rumors ran wild, but Miss Marple's keen eyes saw only the shadow of something darker, an attempt to redirect suspicion, to confuse and divide. Inspector Crayford arrived with the village constable, their expressions grim but methodical. The official investigation was gathering pace, but Miss Marple knew that true understanding would come only from careful, subtle observation, not from the blunt force of questioning. She moved through the village as if in a quiet dance, her presence barely noticed even as she absorbed the nervous glances, the hushed conversations, the tentative alliances forming and dissolving like fragile glass. Each encounter added layers to the picture, a whispered contradiction here, a nervous tick there, that only Miss Marple could decode. At the manor, Henry Lyon was distraught, yet resolute. He spoke with her candidly, revealing his suspicions about an old family feud that had never fully healed. The Wentworths had enemies, he admitted, not just in the village, but within their own walls. Miss Marple nodded. Hatreds often simmer quietly until something, tragedy or betrayal, stirs the pot. That afternoon, she returned to the rose garden, the site of the original crime and the wellspring of so many secrets. The flowers, though tended meticulously, seemed to bend under the weight of their own history. Near the well, she found faint footprints, too small and delicate to belong to any of the usual gardeners or villagers, yet too fresh to be old. Her mind sifted through the possibilities. Who else might have reason to visit the garden unseen? The answer came slowly, piece by piece, as she recalled the nervous glances of the new gardener, a young woman recently employed by the manor. She arranged to speak with her under the pretense of gardening advice. The young woman, named Elsie, was shy and evasive at first, but gradually revealed fragments of overheard conversations and sightings. Late meetings in the garden, whispered threats, the occasional glimpse of a man lurking near the manor at odd hours. Miss Marple's subtle questioning hinted at a deeper web of intrigue, suggesting that the murder was not an isolated act, but part of a larger, more tangled design. That evening, the vicarage was alive with tension as villagers gathered for a hastily called meeting. Fear and suspicion crackled in the air, and accusations were exchanged beneath the polite veneer of social grace. Miss Marple observed the interactions carefully. Charles Wentworth's brother, Philip, was notably agitated, his usual charm replaced by a restless energy. A scathing comment from a local shopkeeper about Philip's rumored debts only added fuel to the fire. Yet it was Mrs. Bradstone's quiet remark to Miss Marple about a missing ledger, a document Edward Wentworth had been desperate to find, that sparked a crucial thought. The ledger, possibly containing financial secrets, might be the key to understanding the motive. The next day, Miss Marple persuaded Henry Lyon to search the manor's library once more. Among the volumes and dusty ledgers, they found a hidden compartment behind a row of books. Inside lay the missing ledger, its pages marked with recent entries that contradicted Edward's public financial statements. The revelations exposed not only mismanagement, but deliberate deception, implicating more than one member of the Wentworth family. The stakes were higher than anyone had imagined, blending personal betrayal with cold calculation. As the village braced itself for the coming storm, Miss Marple prepared her own delicate gambit. She planned to invite all the principal suspects to the manor for a quiet afternoon tea, a setting where her gentle probing and the subtle psychological pressure she was known for could coax the truth from hidden hearts. The stage was set for Chi, a final confrontation, one where human nature itself would betray the murderer. Miss Marple's mind was calm, yet every detail was accounted for. The faintest twitch, the smallest hesitation, the unspoken word. Outside, the roses bloomed defiantly. Against the gathering clouds, their beauty both a mask and a mirror of the village's fragile peace. Inside the manor, beneath polite smiles and measured words, the true game was about to begin. The afternoon sun filtered softly through the tall windows of the Wentworth Manor drawing room, casting gentle pools of light across the polished wood and floral upholstery. Miss Marple, serene as ever in her modest shawl and sensible shoes, surveyed the assembled guests with a quietly appraising eye. The atmosphere, though outwardly civil, simmered with undercurrents of tension, each person caught in the delicate web of suspicion she had begun to weave. Henry Lyon stood near the window, his gaze fixed on the distant rose garden, the memory of his father's death heavy upon him. Lavinia Keene sat quietly by the fire, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the locket Miss Marple had found resting on the nearby table. Philip Wentworth was pacing with restless energy, unable to mask the strain beneath his practiced composure. Elsie, the young gardener, hovered at the edge of the group, nervous but attentive, while Mrs. Bradstone and Miss Lacey exchanged knowing glances. Inspector Crayford, standing by the doorway, kept a wary eye on the proceedings, though it was clear he deferred to Miss Marple's unique understanding of the village's tangled affairs. Miss Marple began with gentle conversation, drawing out remarks and encouraging idle chatter to lower defenses. "The roses are particularly lovely this year, aren't they?" she remarked softly, gesturing toward the window where the garden bloomed vivid and fragrant. "Such beauty, yet even the fairest flowers have their thorns." Her comment was met with polite agreement, but beneath the surface, she noted each subtle shift, a tightening of a jaw, a flicker of eyes, a brief hesitation before speech. Turning toward Philip Wentworth, she inquired, "Philip, I imagine these recent troubles have been most distressing for you, your brother's passing followed by Charles's. Such sorrow in one family." Philip's eyes flashed, a mixture of grief and something more guarded. "It is difficult. But I assure you, Miss Marple, I am committed to uncovering the truth, as much as anyone." Lavinia's soft voice broke the silence. "Sometimes the truth is not what we expect, or what we wish to hear." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, inclining her head. "And sometimes it hides in the smallest details." She turned to Elsie, who suddenly found her voice, albeit shy and uncertain. "I saw someone near the garden well on the night of Edward's death," the young gardener said. "A figure in the shadows. I couldn't see clearly, but they seemed hurried, almost fearful." The room fell quieter. Henry Lyon's brows furrowed. "Did you recognize who it was?" "No," Elsie admitted. "But I remember the scent of tobacco, strong and sharp." Miss Marple's eyes brightened imperceptibly. "A useful detail indeed." "Philip is the only smoker here," Lavinia murmured, her gaze steady on him. Philip's face tightened. "That is nonsense." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Nonsense. Or perhaps a truth one finds difficult to accept." She glanced at Mrs. Bradstone, who offered a subtle nod. "Philip's debts have been the subject of village talk for some time," she said quietly. "Some believe he was desperate for money, more desperate than he admitted. Desperation can lead to unwise decisions," Miss Marple observed mildly. The conversation shifted toward the ledger found in the hidden compartment, the revelations of financial deceit and secret dealings coming to light. Henry Lyon spoke of the pressure Edward had been under, balancing debts and whispered threats. The pieces were assembling, yet the picture remained incomplete. Miss Marple's mind sifted through all she had learned, the whispered arguments, the stolen glances, the quiet fears. Then, with deliberate calm, she addressed the group. "There is one more question I must ask. Who stood to lose the most if the secrets within that ledger were revealed? And who had the opportunity to silence Edward and then Charles?" The guests exchanged uneasy looks, but none answered immediately. The room held its breath as Miss Marple's gaze rested on Philip, then swept slowly over the others, finally landing on Lavinia. "Lavinia," she said softly, "you have been burdened with much. Yet you came forward with your story, which took great courage. But I must ask, is there anything you have yet to reveal? Anything that might help us understand the full truth? Lavinia's hands trembled slightly. There is more than I told. Edward and Charles were not the only ones involved in the past scandals. Some truths are darker than I wish to admit. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. The burden of silence can be heavier than the truth itself. Lavinia's voice dropped. Philip. He was involved, not just in the financial troubles, but in threats made to keep the family's secrets hidden. I overheard him arguing with Edward the night before his death. A sharp intake of breath echoed through the room. Philip's face hardened. These are serious accusations. They are, Miss Marple agreed. And it is precisely because they are serious that we must listen carefully. She turned to Inspector Crayford. Would you be so kind as to accompany Philip to the study? There are some questions that need answering, away from the eyes and ears of others. As Philip reluctantly followed the inspector, the atmosphere in the room shifted, relief mingling with apprehension. Miss Marple settled back, her eyes thoughtful. Moments later, Henry Lyon approached her quietly. Miss Marple, how did you come to suspect Philip so strongly? She smiled gently. Sometimes, Henry, the truth is less about what is said and more about what is not said. Nervous glances, avoidance of certain topics, and a faint scent of tobacco in an unexpected place. Henry's eyes widened in understanding. Before the conversation could continue, a sudden cry rang from the study. Everyone rushed in to find Philip slumped over a desk, a faint trace of white powder on his lips, eyes glassy and unfocused. Quick action from Inspector Crayford and the local doctor saved him from a worse fate, but the attempt on his life was unmistakable. The room fell silent, the gravity of the situation settling upon them all. Miss Marple looked around, her gaze steady and resolute. The murderer was growing desperate, their mask beginning to slip. The final act was near, and the subtle game of human nature would soon reveal all. The roses outside continued to bloom, their beauty sharp and uncompromising, an apt reflection of the truth that waited just beneath the surface. The manor had settled into a tense quiet after Philip's near-fatal collapse. The doctor's careful ministrations had stabilized him, but the grim reality was unmistakable. Someone within the household had attempted to silence him permanently. The shadows in the once charming rooms deepened, mirroring the shadows now, cast upon the hearts of the villagers. Miss Marple stood by the window, her gaze drifting over the rose garden once more. The delicate blooms were touched with early frost, a reminder of the fragility of beauty and truth alike. She knew that the murderer was growing reckless, their desperation unmasking vulnerabilities that could be used against them. But caution was still essential. A wrong accusation could ruin innocent lives and unsettle the village irreparably. Inspector Crayford had begun methodical questioning, yet it was clear that it was Miss Marple's quiet wisdom the villagers leaned on. Often, without realizing it, she had asked to speak privately with Henry Lyon, whose knowledge of the family's inner workings was profound, and with Lavinia Keene, whose admission had first opened the door to secrets that had long been buried beneath polite smiles and well-tended gardens. In the library, where the fire's glow softened the edges of the heavy volumes lining the walls, Miss Marple gently prodded Henry about his late father's affairs. You mentioned that your father had enemies, Henry. Do you think any of those resentments might have festered enough to lead to murder? Henry nodded slowly, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Yes, I believe so. Edward's efforts to keep the family finances afloat were strained by more than just bad luck. Some villagers and even family members were deeply threatened by his plans to sell off parts of the estate to cover debts. That would have upset the delicate balance of power. And who, do you suppose, would be most opposed to such plans? Miss Marple inquired softly. Henry's eyes darkened. Philip? He was desperate for money, yes, but also desperate to maintain his standing in the village. Selling the estate would have ruined his reputation and his prospects. Miss Marple nodded, filing this insight carefully away. And Lavinia, I wonder if you might tell me more about what you overheard between Philip and Edward the night before Edward's death? Lavinia looked down at her hands, hesitating briefly before speaking. It was a heated argument. Philip was furious, accusing Edward of betrayal and threatening to ruin him if he went through with the sale. Edward tried to calm him, but the tension was unmistakable. Afterward, Philip left the house abruptly. And did anyone see him after that? Miss Marple pressed gently. No, Lavinia replied, which is why I was so startled to find him later that evening near the rose garden well, arguing quietly with someone I could not see. Miss Marple's mind pieced together the puzzle. The garden, the late-night meeting, the concealed ledger, the threats, all signs of a carefully orchestrated plot. But who was the unseen figure? Before she could dwell longer on the question, the door opened and Inspector Crayford entered, a grim look upon his face. Miss Marple, there's been another development. The doctor has confirmed that the poison found on Philip was administered in extremely small, precise amounts. It was meant to incapacitate, not kill outright. An intimidation. And yet, Miss Marple said quietly, it reveals a killer growing bolder. The inspector nodded. We've also found traces of the same poison on the handle of the garden well bucket. Whoever the murderer is, they have returned to the scene, perhaps careless or confident. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with a newfound clarity. Then the garden well must be examined thoroughly. There is more to be discovered there. Together, they walked out into the chilly afternoon. The village seemed to hold its breath, the peaceful beauty of the roses contrasting sharply with the grim realities hidden beneath. At the well, Miss Marple crouched, inspecting the ground closely. Her sharp eyes caught faint impressions, footprints too delicate to be Philip's heavy tread, nor Elsie's familiar paths. She reached down and brushed away some soil, revealing a small scrap of fabric caught on a thorn bush. This is significant, she murmured, holding it up for the inspector to see. This fabric does not belong to any of the known staff or family members. Could it be from the stranger seen lurking in the garden? Crayford asked. Possibly, she said thoughtfully. Or from someone trying to disguise their presence. Discovery of the scrap raised the stakes further. Whoever the murderer was, they were hiding in plain sight among those who had access to the manor and grounds. The question remained, who had motive and opportunity? Back inside, the manor was thick with whispered conversations and nervous glances. Miss Marple gathered the key figures in the drawing room once again, her voice calm but resolute. I believe the truth lies in the intersections of past grievances, hidden debts, and the fear of exposure, she said. The ledger uncovered in the library was more than just financial records. It was a map of secrets, some of which were dangerous enough to kill to protect. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. The attempt on Philip's life was meant to silence a threat. Yet, the smallest clue, a scrap of fabric, reveals a presence not accounted for. Her gaze swept across the faces, lingering on each in turn. Now is the time for honesty. Each of you knows more than you have admitted. Secrets protect no one but the guilty. The room stilled, tension coiling tighter. Miss Marple turned gently toward Elsie. Young lady, you have seen much. Do you recall any visitors to the garden or manor at unusual hours? Elsie's eyes filled with tears. There was a man, sir, a stranger, dark-haired, who spoke to Philip in whispers. He seemed to come and go quickly. I thought it was just business, but now— Miss Marple nodded. You were right to notice. Then, she addressed Lavinia. You two have carried burdens alone. It is time to share all you know. Lavinia swallowed hard and spoke. That man, he was Philip's associate from London, someone involved in the financial dealings. Philip feared him. Henry Lyon's expression hardened. Philip never told us about this man. Miss Marple concluded, this stranger, with access and motive, is key. The fabric found near the well may belong to him. A sudden knock at the door interrupted the confession. A breathless messenger announced the arrival of a visitor. The man who entered was tall and impeccably dressed, but there was a coldness in his eyes that sent a shiver through the room. Mr. Gregory Holt, he introduced himself smoothly. I'm here regarding the late Edward Wentworth's estate and business affairs. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. You must be the man Elsie described. Mr. Holt smiled thinly. I have come to resolve matters and ensure the family's interests are protected. The room was thick with suspicion, but Miss Marple's serene voice broke through. Mr. Holt, your arrival is most timely. Please join us. There are many questions only you can answer. As the guests settled, the final act of this intricate drama drew closer, the delicate dance of deception poised on the edge of revelation. Outside, the roses seemed to shiver in the cooling breeze, the silent witnesses to a tale of greed, fear, and the fatal consequences of secrets kept too long. The drawing room felt charged with a tension so palpable it seemed to thicken the very air. Mr. Gregory Holt's arrival, so unexpected yet precise in its timing, had unsettled the gathering. Miss Marple studied him carefully. His polished exterior, the effortless confidence in his posture, and the faintest twitch in his eyes that betrayed a calculation beneath his smooth words. Mr. Holt, Miss Marple began with her usual calm, we understand you were acquainted with the late Edward Wentworth and his son Philip? Yes, Holt replied, voice smooth as silk. I was Edward's financial advisor, though I prefer the term business associate. The Wentworth estate's troubles were, I must confess, quite complex, and I was trying to navigate them to avoid disaster. Complex indeed, Miss A. Marple said softly. And yet it appears the family was beset by more than mere financial woes. Holt's eyes flickered briefly. Tragedies such as these often have many layers, but I assure you, my intentions have been nothing but honorable. At that moment, Inspector Crayford cleared his throat. Mr. Holt, we understand there has been an attempt on Philip's life, and earlier, the unfortunate death of Edward Wentworth. Your presence here at such a critical juncture cannot be mere coincidence. Can you account for your whereabouts on the night Edward died? Holt's gaze swept the room before settling on Miss Marple's steady eyes. I was in London, attending to urgent matters regarding other clients. I have documents and witnesses to verify that. Miss Marple, ever gentle, probed further. Yet, Philip seemed deeply troubled by your presence, even fearful. Lavinia mentioned secret meetings in the garden, and Elsie saw a man speaking with Philip in hushed tones. Was that you, Mr. Holt? There was a flicker of hesitation in Holt's eyes, but he quickly masked it. I did meet Philip on occasion. Business required discretion, but I never wished harm to anyone. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Discretion is often a veil for deeper truths, Mr. Holt. You must forgive me for saying so, but your arrival, now, after Edward's death and the poisoning attempt, raises suspicions. The room held its breath as Holt smiled thinly, unmoved. Suspicion is a tool, Miss Marple. I am here to clear the fog, not add to it. Miss Marple glanced toward Henry Lyon, who had been silent during the exchange. Henry, can you confirm Mr. Holt's London alibi? Were you in contact with your brother Philip on that night? Henry looked troubled, then shook his head. No, I wasn't. Philip was elusive, avoiding calls. But I find it strange Mr. Holt claims to be in London when Philip feared him so much. Lavinia Keene spoke up hesitantly. I overheard Philip say something about debts and threats. I think Mr. Holt had more power over Philip than he admits. Suddenly, Elsie, the timid maid, whispered, There was a letter I found in the library. A note Philip dropped. It mentioned meeting someone. To settle accounts. The handwriting looked hurried and scared. Miss Marple gently took the letter, scanning the scrawled words. It read, Must meet tonight. No witnesses. If not, all is lost. An urgent meeting indeed, Miss Marple mused, and one that seems to have been intercepted by tragedy. Inspector. Crayford interjected. The garden well remains a focus. The poison was found there and the fabric scrap nearby. Do we know whose it is yet? Miss Marple shook her head. Not yet, but I believe Mr. Holt's visit will help us unravel that thread. His presence at this manor and the timing of his arrival are too precise. Holt's smile faded, his composure slipping just slightly. You insinuate I am a murderer, Miss Marple? No, Mr. Holt, she said softly. I merely seek the truth wherever it may lead, and truth is rarely as simple as it seems. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple requested that Holt join her for a quiet walk in the garden. The others watched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension as the two figures moved toward the roses, their conversation hushed but intense. Outside, the night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and fading blossoms. Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the faintest signs of disturbance near the well, subtle scrapes on the stone, footprints in the soft ground, and a slight indent where something had been hastily removed. Mr. Holt, she said quietly, you spoke of settling accounts, yet someone here is desperate to keep their secrets buried. Can you help me understand who benefits from silencing Philip and his father? Holt hesitated, then sighed. The estate was on the brink of collapse. Philip was reckless, borrowing heavily and gambling with the family's future. If his debts had been exposed, ruin would have followed. And who would have been most affected by that ruin? Myself, certainly, Holt admitted reluctantly. I had a vested interest in keeping the estate afloat, but I did not wish anyone dead. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Often, financial desperation drives men to dark places, but murder is a step beyond. They returned indoors just as a sudden commotion erupted in the hall. Elsie had found something in the servants' quarters. The group hurried to see what it was. Elsie held out a small folded piece of paper, damp and slightly torn. Miss Marple took it and carefully unfolded it. It was a note, written in hurried script. Meet me at midnight by the old oak. All debts will be cleared if you come alone. The handwriting was unmistakably Philip's. The plot thickens, Miss Marple murmured. Someone was negotiating in secret. The question is, who? Eyes darted around the room, suspicion and fear simmering beneath the surface. Inspector Crayford looked at Holt. Midnight meetings, secret letters. This man's involvement deepens. Holt swallowed hard. I admit Philip was involved in desperate dealings, but I swear I sought only to help. Miss Marple looked steadily at each person. There is one more thing, a detail overlooked by all but myself. The signature on the ledger was forged, a subtle alteration meant to deceive. A gasp rippled through the room. Who would gain by fabricating debts? Miss Marple asked quietly. Lavinia's eyes widened. Philip himself. He needed to hide his losses, to keep up appearances, Miss Marple nodded. And that, dear friends, gives motive not just to outsiders, but to those within this household. Greed, fear, and deception have woven a tangled web. She turned to Mr. Holt. Your arrival has stirred the still waters, Mr. Holt, but it is not yet clear whether you are a fisherman or the one caught in the net. The room was thick with silence, each person wrestling with their own secrets now brought to light. Miss Marple's gaze softened as she concluded, the next steps must be careful. The truth is near, and with it, justice. Outside, the wind whispered through the rose bushes, as if urging the village's long-held secrets to finally bloom in the harsh light of day.